Hello everyone, welcome back to Buried Files. Tonight we bring you 7 deeply disturbing true lighthouse keeper horror stories that will make you question what really happens when human beings are isolated at the edge of the world, where land meets endless ocean. These are not fictional tales, but real encounters documented by lighthouse keepers who faced the unknown in America's most remote and unforgiving maritime stations. Each story has been gathered from keeper testimonials, historical records, and first-hand accounts that reveal the psychological and paranormal terrors that await in these solitary towers. Lighthouses were built to guide ships to safety, but some of them harbor darkness that no beam of light can ever penetrate. If you enjoy authentic horror content that exposes the terrifying reality of isolation and the unexplained, subscribe to Buried Files and hit the notification bell so you never miss our investigations into true maritime horror. After you hear these harrowing testimonies, we want to know in the comments below if you would ever take a job as a lighthouse keeper after learning what truly awaits in these isolated stations. Now prepare yourself as we descend into the 7 most disturbing true lighthouse keeper horror stories ever documented. 3 years ago, I accepted a position that would change my life forever. I was stationed at Beacon Point Lighthouse off the coast of Maine, and the pay was decent enough for someone fresh out of college who needed isolation to finish writing a novel. I had graduated with a degree in English literature and had spent the last year working retail jobs that drained every ounce of creativity from my body. When I saw the listing for a lighthouse keeper position that offered room and board plus a modest salary, I applied immediately without really understanding what I was getting myself into. The job description made it sound romantic, almost like something out of a Gothic novel. I would be responsible for basic maintenance, monitoring weather equipment, and serving as an emergency contact point for the Coast Guard. The lighthouse itself had been automated decades ago, so the actual light required no manual operation. It seemed perfect for someone like me who wanted nothing more than solitude and time to write. The interview process was surprisingly brief. The hiring manager, an older man from the Maritime Historical Preservation Society, asked me only a handful of questions about my comfort with isolation and my ability to handle basic repairs. He mentioned that the position had high turnover and that most keepers stayed only a single season before requesting transfer. I assumed this was because of the harsh Maine winters or perhaps the monotony of the work. He did not mention anything else, and I did not think to ask why so many people left. I should have asked more questions, but I was young and desperate to escape the suffocating routine of my life. I signed the contract that same afternoon. Beacon Point Lighthouse sits on a rocky outcrop about 2 miles from the nearest coastal town. It is accessible only by boat, and during severe weather, that boat cannot make the crossing safely. The structure itself dates back to 1867, a towering white cylinder with red trim that rises 115 feet above the churning Atlantic. The keeper's quarters occupy the base of the lighthouse, a compact 2-room living space with a kitchen area, a small bedroom, and a bathroom that was clearly added long after the original construction. Everything about the place felt frozen in time, as though decades had passed without anyone caring enough to modernize beyond the absolute necessities. The walls were thick stone, the windows were narrow and drafty, and the spiral staircase that led up to the lantern room was made of iron that groaned with every step. I arrived at Beacon Point in late October, right at the end of the traditional keeper rotation season. The man I was replacing, whose name I never learned, barely spoke to me during the 30-minute handover. He showed me where the tools were kept, how to check the weather monitoring equipment, and how to contact the mainland in case of emergency. He seemed exhausted, with deep circles under his eyes and a nervous energy that made me uncomfortable. When I asked him if he had any advice for me, He paused at the door with his bags already in hand, and it said only, "Do not go up to the lantern room after dark unless you absolutely have to." Then he left without another word, practically running down to the dock where the supply boat waited. I watched him leave and felt my first real twinge of unease. But I dismissed it as the paranoia of someone who had spent too long in isolation. The first 3 nights at Beacon Point were exactly what I had hoped for. I spent my days exploring the rocky coastline, taking photographs, and making notes for my novel. In the evenings, I cooked simple meals and read by lamplight in the keeper's quarters. The sound of the ocean was constant, a rhythmic crashing that became almost meditative after a while. I felt more at peace than I had in years. The lighthouse beam swept across the darkness every 15 seconds, its automated rotation so precise that I could set my watch by it. I began to establish a routine, waking early to check equipment, spending midday writing, and using the evenings to maintain the building and grounds. On my 4th night at Beacon Point, while I was reviewing the maintenance logs in the keeper's quarters, I discovered something that made my blood run cold. The logs were kept in a series of leather-bound journals that dated back decades, each one filled with the neat handwriting of various keepers documenting weather conditions, equipment repairs, and supply deliveries. I had been reading through them out of curiosity, enjoying the glimpse into the lives of the men and women who had kept this lighthouse operational over the years. Most entries were mundane, but then I found a journal from 1923, and within its pages were entries that did not match the others in tone or content. The keeper's name had been Ashton McGregor, and his entries from September through November of that year grew increasingly disturbed. He wrote about hearing footsteps ascending the spiral staircase at exactly 2:47 in the morning, every single night without fail. At first, McGregor assumed it was the metal contracting in the cold, but he began to notice that the footsteps had a rhythm, a deliberate pace that suggested something walking rather than something settling. He wrote that he would lie awake, listening to them climb, counting each step, and that they always stopped just outside the lantern room door. McGregor's final entry, dated November 19th, simply read, "The footsteps reached 47 tonight. There are only 42 steps. I do not know what this means, but I am afraid to find out." I sat in the dim light of the keeper's quarters, staring at those words and feeling a chill that had nothing to do with the ocean wind seeping through the walls. I told myself it was just the frightened imagination of a man who had been isolated too long, that there was nothing supernatural about old buildings making noise at night. Metal expands and contracts, wood settles, wind creates strange sounds in confined spaces. I closed the journal and tried to return to my own writing, but I could not concentrate. The words from 1923 kept echoing in my mind. That night, at exactly 2:47 in the morning, I heard the footsteps for the first time. I was lying in bed, not quite asleep, but hovering in that space between wakefulness and dreams, when the sound jerked me fully alert. It was exactly as McGregor had described. Slow, methodical footsteps climbing the iron spiral staircase. Each footfall created a distinct metallic ring that echoed through the hollow tower. I lay frozen, barely breathing, as the footsteps ascended. I began counting them automatically. 1, 2, 3. The rhythm never varied, never hesitated. 10, 15, 20. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it might burst. 30, 35, 40. The footsteps reached the level where I knew the lantern room door should stop them, but they did not stop. 41, 42, 43. They continued climbing stairs that did not exist. 44, 45, 46, 47, then silence. I remained in my bed for another hour, too terrified to move. before I finally forced myself to get up. I grabbed a heavy flashlight from the kitchen and slowly opened the door to the stairwell. The beam of my flashlight revealed nothing but empty iron steps spiraling upward into darkness. I climbed carefully, checking each step, but found nothing unusual. The lantern room door was closed just as I had left it. I opened it and swept my light across the circular chamber. Everything was exactly as it should be. The automated beacon rotated smoothly on its mount, casting its powerful beam out across the black ocean. There was no sign that anyone or anything had been there. I tried to convince myself that I had imagined it, or that I had heard some acoustic trick caused by the wind or the waves. But I knew what I had heard. Those footsteps had been real, and they had climbed beyond the physical limits of the staircase. I barely slept for the remainder of that night. And when dawn finally came, I felt exhausted and shaken. The footsteps came again the next night, and the night after that. Always at 2:47 in the morning, always 47 steps. I began to document them in the current maintenance log, just as McGregor must have done nearly a century before me. I told myself I was being scientific, collecting data, but really, I was just trying to maintain some sense of control over a situation that made no rational sense. On the 8th night, I made a decision that I would later recognize as either incredibly brave or phenomenally stupid. I positioned myself on the staircase before 2:47, sitting on one of the iron steps about halfway up, flashlight in hand and my phone recording audio. I wanted proof, or at least confirmation, that I was not losing my mind. When 2:47 arrived, the footsteps began right on schedule. But this time, I was in their path. The sound started below me at the base of the lighthouse and began climbing toward me. I could feel the vibrations through the iron steps beneath me, could hear the distinct ring of footfalls on metal. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely hold the flashlight. The footsteps climbed closer. 10 steps below me. 5 steps below me. I shone my light down the stairwell and saw absolutely nothing. But the footsteps continued. 3 steps below me. 2 steps. I pressed myself against the curved wall as the sound reached the step I was sitting on, and I swear I felt something pass through me. A coldness so intense, it felt like being plunged into Arctic water. Then the footsteps continued upward, and I could do nothing but sit there trembling and counting. 43, 44, 45, 46, 47. Silence. I reviewed the audio recording immediately, my hands still shaking. The footsteps were captured clearly on the recording, each one distinct and unmistakable. I had proof that I was not hallucinating. But that proof only made everything more terrifying. Something was climbing those stairs every night, something I could hear and apparently feel, but could not see. The following day, I took the supply boat to the mainland and spent hours in the local historical society archives, searching for information about Ashton McGregor and Beacon Point Lighthouse. What I discovered made the situation infinitely worse. McGregor had died on November 20th, 1923, the day after his final journal entry. According to the official report, he had fallen from the lighthouse gallery, the narrow walkway that encircles the lantern room at the top of the structure. The fall had killed him instantly. The report ruled it an accidental death. But there was a handwritten note in the margin from the investigating officer that simply said, "Peculiar that an experienced keeper would be on the gallery in darkness during a storm." I dug deeper and eventually found McGregor's personal effects, which had been donated to the Historical Society decades earlier. Among them was a second journal, one that had not been kept in the official logs at the lighthouse. In this private journal, McGregor wrote about his partner keeper, a man whose name had been redacted from all official documents. McGregor described this man as increasingly violent and erratic, prone to fits of rage and paranoid delusions. The final entries suggested that McGregor feared for his safety and had written to the Maritime Authority requesting an emergency transfer. That transfer never came. The implication was clear, though never officially stated. McGregor had not fallen from the gallery. He had been pushed. And whatever remained of him, or whatever echo of his final moments persisted, was still climbing those stairs every night, still counting the steps he took before he reached the top, before someone pushed him over the railing to his death, 47 steps up in a lighthouse that only had 42. I returned to Beacon Point that evening because I had signed a contract, and because I foolishly thought I could handle a few more nights. But on my final night at the lighthouse, the footsteps did not stop outside the lantern room door. For the first time since I had arrived, they continued into the lantern room itself. I heard the iron door creak open, heard the footsteps cross the floor above me. I grabbed my phone and fled to my bedroom, locking the door behind me, even though I knew a lock would do nothing against something that was not physical. Then I heard it. A sound I will never forget as long as I live. Someone was tapping on the glass of the lantern room windows, and the automated beacon's light was flickering in a pattern. I recorded it on my phone, my hands shaking so badly the video was almost unusable. Later, when I showed that video to someone who knew Morse code, they told me what the pattern spelled out. Just one word as repeated over and over in the flickering light. Pushed, pushed, pushed. I evacuated at dawn when the supply boat arrived, my relief keeper taking one look at my face and not asking any questions. I submitted my resignation that same day. I later learned that the lighthouse authorities had commissioned a full investigation into McGregor's death after I shared what I had found. The case was officially reopened, and though they never found enough evidence for criminal charges, the historical record was amended to note that McGregor's death was likely not accidental. His family, what remained of them, finally had some measure of closure. I never returned to lighthouse keeping after that. Some places hold memories in their walls, echoes of violence and fear that refuse to fade. And not every death is an accident. If you ever take work in isolated places, know that you might not be as alone as you think, and the dead do not always rest quietly. I need to tell someone what happened at Raven's Cry Lighthouse because I cannot carry this alone anymore. I was working as assistant keeper during the winter of 2018, and I witnessed something that still makes me question reality itself. My name is Brielle, and before this experience, I considered myself a rational person, grounded in science and logic. I had studied marine biology in college and had always been drawn to the ocean, fascinated by its depth and mystery. When the opportunity came to work as an assistant lighthouse keeper on the Pacific Northwest coast, I jumped at it. The position offered hands-on experience with weather monitoring equipment and wildlife observation, both of which would benefit my career. I thought I understood the ocean. I thought I knew what lived in its depths and moved across its surface. I was wrong about everything. Raven's Cry Lighthouse stands on a jagged promontory of volcanic rock about 15 miles south of the Washington-Oregon border, accessible only by helicopter or a treacherous boat landing that is only safe during calm seas. The lighthouse itself was built in 1903 after a series of devastating shipwrecks claimed over 200 lives in the span of 5 years. The local indigenous communities had warned against building shipping routes through that particular stretch of water, claiming it was a place where the boundary between worlds grew thin, where things that should not exist could cross over during certain conditions. The government ignored these warnings, as governments tend to do, and built the lighthouse as a solution to what they saw as a navigation problem rather than a spiritual one. I arrived at Raven's Cry in November, just as the winter storm season was beginning. The head keeper was a man in his late 50s named Whitman, a career lighthouse keeper who had spent over 30 years at various stations along the coast. He was quiet and methodical, the kind of man who measured his words carefully and never spoke unless he had something meaningful to say. During my first week, he taught me the routines of lighthouse keeping. Checking the automated beacon system twice daily, monitoring weather equipment, maintaining the generator, and keeping detailed logs of everything from barometric pressure to wildlife sightings. The work was physically demanding but satisfying, and I found myself falling into a comfortable rhythm alongside Whitman. The fishing communities in the nearest coastal town, a small place called Mercy Harbor about 20 miles north, had a strange relationship with Raven's Cry Lighthouse. When I went ashore for supplies during my second week, I stopped at a general store where an elderly woman working the counter asked me where I was stationed. When I told her Raven's Cry, her expression changed immediately. She leaned across the counter and said in a low voice, "You watch for the fog, girl. The fog that moves wrong. The fog that brings visitors." I asked her what she meant, but she would not elaborate, only shaking her head and bagging my groceries in silence. I mentioned this conversation to Whitman that evening, and he dismissed it with a wave of his hand, saying that coastal communities always had superstitions about lighthouses and that we should not pay attention to local folklore. But I could tell from the way his jaw tightened when I mentioned the fog that he knew more than he was saying. Winter on the Pacific Northwest coast is brutal in ways that people who have never experienced it cannot truly understand. The storms roll in from the ocean with a ferocity that seems almost alive. Waves reaching heights of 40 and 50 feet. Wind speeds that can tear metal from its moorings. We had weathered several significant storms during my first month at Raven's Cry, and I had grown accustomed to the violence of it. The way the lighthouse would shudder and groan, but ultimately stand firm against the assault. Whitman and I had developed an efficient partnership, moving through emergency protocols with practiced coordination whenever a major system rolled through. It was during a massive storm in mid-January that everything changed. The Weather Service had been tracking a low-pressure system for days, warning that it would be one of the most severe storms of the season. We prepared accordingly, securing everything that could be secured, checking backup systems and laying in extra supplies in case we were cut off from resupply for an extended period. The storm hit at dusk on a Friday, and within hours the wind was howling at over 90 miles per hour, driving rain so hard it sounded like gravel being thrown against the lighthouse walls. Around midnight, as the storm reached its peak intensity, something changed. I was in the equipment room checking the backup generator when I noticed through the narrow window that the quality of the darkness outside had shifted. Despite the rain and wind, I could see a fog rolling in from the ocean. But it was unlike any fog I had ever seen. It was thick and yellowish gray, with a texture that seemed almost solid, and it was moving against the wind. That should have been impossible. Fog is essentially a cloud at ground level, composed of water droplets suspended in air, and it moves with wind currents, not against them. But this fog was pushing inland directly into the teeth of the gale, as though it had its own propulsion. I called for Whitman, and he came immediately. When he looked out the window and saw the fog, all color drained from his face. Without a word, he began moving through the lighthouse, checking every door and window, ensuring everything was locked and sealed. I followed him, confused and increasingly frightened by his behavior. "What is happening?" I asked him. "What is that fog?" He did not answer me at first, just continued his inspection of the lighthouse's security. Finally, when every entrance was secured, he turned to me and said, "We are going to stay in the central corridor tonight. No one goes near the doors or windows. No matter what you hear, no matter what you see, we do not open anything. Do you understand me?" I told him I did not understand, that he needed to explain what was happening. That is when he told me about what happened 5 years earlier, during his first winter at Raven's Cry. The same kind of fog had come during a storm, and the assistant keeper at that time, a young man fresh out of the Coast Guard, had seen something moving in the fog through the lantern room windows. Against Whitman's warnings, the young man had opened the lantern room door to get a better look. Whitman found him 3 days later on the rocks below the lighthouse, alive but completely catatonic. When they finally got him to a hospital, he remained unresponsive for 2 weeks. When he finally regained the ability to speak, he spoke only in a language that linguists could not identify, a series of clicking sounds and guttural syllables that did not match any known human language. He was eventually institutionalized, and as far as Whitman knew, he remained there still, never recovering his original language or memories. Before I could fully process what Whitman had told me, we heard the first scratching sounds on the exterior walls of the lighthouse. They started low, near the base of the structure. A sound like fingernails on stone, except amplified 1,000 times. The scratching moved upward, circling the lighthouse in a spiral pattern. Through the narrow window slits, I could see shapes moving in the yellow fog, tall and elongated, moving with a fluidity that did not match any animal I had ever studied. The scratching grew louder, more insistent, and then we heard something that made my blood turn to ice. A voice called my name. Not just any voice, but my grandmother's voice, clear and distinct. "Brielle, honey, open the door. I am so cold out here." My grandmother had died 3 years earlier from cancer, and hearing her voice so perfectly replicated, speaking words she would have said, broke something in my mind. I moved toward the door without consciously deciding to do so, drawn by a need so powerful it overrode every rational thought. Whitman grabbed my arm, pulled me back, but I fought against him. The voice kept calling, "Brielle, please. It is so cold. I just want to come inside where it is warm. Do not you want to see me again?" I do not remember much of what happened next. Whitman told me later that I had nearly overpowered him, that I was screaming and clawing at the door, trying to get it open. He said I was speaking in a voice that did not sound like my own, saying things in that same clicking language the previous assistant keeper had used. He had to physically restrain me, and eventually he dragged me to the equipment room and locked me inside for my own safety. From inside that room, I could still hear the voices. Not just my grandmother now, but others. My mother, my college roommate who had died in a car accident, my high school boyfriend. All of them calling to me, all of them begging me to open the door, to let them in where it was warm and safe. And underneath their voices, I heard something else. A sound that was not quite laughter and not quite screaming, something that made me understand on a primal level that whatever was out there was not human, had never been human, and wanted very badly to make me think otherwise. The scratching intensified until it sounded like the entire exterior of the lighthouse was being clawed by 1,000 hands. The beacon in the lantern room began to dim, the electrical system fluctuating despite having no mechanical reason to do so. Through the narrow window of the equipment room, I watched as the yellow fog pressed against the glass, and within it, I saw faces forming and dissolving, mouths opening impossibly wide, eyes that were just dark holes in pale flesh. Then something massive hit the main door with enough force to crack the heavy reinforced wood. I heard Whitman shouting, heard him dragging furniture to barricade the entrance. Another impact. The wood splintered. I pressed myself into the corner of the equipment room, sobbing, convinced that whatever was outside was going to get in and that we were going to die or worse. The assault continued for what felt like hours. Impact after impact against the door. The voices never stopped calling. The scratching never ceased. At some point, I passed out from sheer terror and exhaustion. When I woke, sunlight was streaming through the window. The storm had passed. The fog was gone. I stumbled out of the equipment room to find Whitman sitting on the floor near the barricaded door, looking like he had aged 10 years overnight. Together, we carefully removed the barricade and opened the door. The sight that greeted us was something out of a nightmare. Every surface of the lighthouse exterior was covered in deep claw marks, gouges in the stone and metal that went down several inches. The marks were not consistent with any animal. They were too large, too deep, and too numerous. Some of them appeared to have been made by hands, with too many fingers. The door itself, 3 inches of reinforced wood and metal, had a crack running through it from top to bottom. We documented everything with photographs, but we both knew without discussing it that no one would believe us. We would be dismissed as having experienced some kind of shared psychotic episode brought on by isolation and storm stress. Whitman submitted his resignation that same day. I lasted another week before I could not take it anymore and requested an immediate transfer. The official report stated that the damage to the lighthouse was caused by debris thrown by the storm, and the cracked door was attributed to wind pressure and age. The lighthouse now requires a minimum of 3 keepers at all times, though the official reason given is operational efficiency. The doors have all been replaced with steel-reinforced versions that lock from the inside with heavy deadbolts. I transferred to an inland research station where I work with freshwater systems and never have to see the ocean. I still have nightmares about that night, about the yellow fog and the voices calling my name. Sometimes I wake up speaking in that clicking language, words forming on my tongue that I do not understand. Whitman and I exchange emails occasionally, but we never discuss what happened. There is nothing to say. We both know what we experienced, and we both know that the ocean keeps its secrets. But sometimes those secrets come looking for witnesses. If you ever take work near the water, trust the warnings of people who have lived there their entire lives. Some knowledge is passed down through generations for a reason. And some doors should never be opened, no matter who is calling your name from the other side. Back in 2015, I took a winter contract at Northwatch Lighthouse because I needed money and did not mind isolation. What I found there still wakes me up at night, and I have never told anyone the complete truth about what happened. My name is Declan, and before I accepted that position, I was working construction jobs across the Northern Territories, moving from site to site, barely making enough to cover my debts. When a recruiter contacted me about an emergency replacement position at an Arctic lighthouse, offering 3 times my usual pay for a 3-month commitment, I did not hesitate. I should have asked why they were so desperate to fill the position. I should have questioned why the previous keeper had left so abruptly that they needed someone immediately, regardless of experience. But I was broke and desperate, and desperation makes you ignore warning signs that would otherwise seem obvious. The recruiter explained that the previous keeper, a man named Boyd, had been evacuated for medical reasons, and that I would be taking over his duties until a permanent replacement could be found. Northwatch Lighthouse sits on a barren rock island about 40 miles off the northern coast of Alaska. one of the most remote lighthouse stations still in operation. During winter, the island is completely cut off from the mainland, except for emergency helicopter evacuations and monthly supply drops, weather permitting. The lighthouse itself was built in 1937 to guide ships through the treacherous waters of the Bering Strait, and it has been continuously manned ever since, despite multiple attempts to automate it. The harsh conditions and frequent equipment failures made human oversight necessary, even in the modern age. I arrived at Northwatch in mid-December during a blizzard that nearly prevented the helicopter from landing. The pilot dropped me and my supplies on the landing pad and took off immediately, clearly eager to leave before conditions worsened. I watched the helicopter disappear into the swirling snow and felt the first real stab of fear. The isolation was absolute. There was nothing but ice, rock, and the lighthouse towering above me, its beam cutting through the white darkness every 10 seconds. I gathered my supplies and made my way to the entrance, a heavy steel door that had been left unlocked for my arrival. The interior of Northwatch was exactly what I expected. Functional, sparse, and cold, despite the heating system running at full capacity. The living quarters consisted of a small kitchen, a bedroom, a bathroom, and a common area with a radio for communication with the mainland. The lighthouse tower rose above the living quarters, accessed by a narrow stairwell that led up to the beacon room. Everything was clean and organized, but there was something unsettling about the place that I could not immediately identify. It felt abandoned in a way that went beyond the previous keeper's departure, as though no one had truly lived there in years. I spent my first 2 days settling in and familiarizing myself with the equipment and routines. The work was straightforward: monitor the beacon, check weather instruments, maintain the generator, and report conditions to the mainland twice daily via radio. The isolation did not bother me initially. I had spent months at remote construction sites and was accustomed to my own company. But on my third night at Northwatch, while organizing supplies in the storage room, I discovered something that changed everything. Behind a loose panel in the storage room wall, I found a journal. The handwriting on the cover identified it as belonging to Boyd, the keeper I had replaced. I knew immediately that I should not read it, that whatever was written inside was private and likely the reason Boyd had left so abruptly. But curiosity and the desperate boredom of isolation overrode my better judgment. I took the journal to my bedroom and began reading. The early entries were mundane, typical observations about weather and routine maintenance. But after the first month, Boyd's tone began to change. He wrote about hearing his name being called from outside the lighthouse, always at night, always when the wind was at its strongest. At first, he assumed it was an auditory hallucination caused by the wind whistling through the rocks, a common phenomenon in harsh environments. But the calling persisted, and Boyd began to notice other things. Footprints would appear in the snow around the lighthouse, circling the building in perfect rings, even though Boyd had not gone outside. The footprints were always there in the morning, fresh despite the constant snowfall that should have buried them. Boyd's entries grew increasingly paranoid. He wrote about feeling watched, about hearing movement in the lower levels of the lighthouse, about being convinced that someone else was living in the building with him. He described lying awake at night, listening to breathing sounds that came from inside the walls, rhythmic and slow, as though something large was sleeping just beyond the stone and metal. The final entry, dated just 3 days before my arrival, was barely legible, the handwriting shaky and desperate. I can hear them in the basement. I know someone is down there, the basement that is not supposed to exist. I'm going to find the entrance tonight. If I do not make it back, tell my sister I love her. I sat in my bed, the journal trembling in my hands, and felt ice form in my stomach. According to the building plans I'd been given during my briefing, Northwatch Lighthouse had no basement. The structure was built directly on bedrock, with the living quarters at ground level and the tower extending upward. There should not have been any lower levels, but Boyd had found something, and it had frightened him enough to request emergency evacuation. I should have reported the journal immediately. I should have contacted the mainland and asked for clarification. But part of me, the part that had always been drawn to mysteries and hidden things, needed to know what Boyd had found. I waited until morning, then began a systematic search of the lower level, looking for any entrance or access point that might lead to a basement or sub-level. It took me most of the day, but I finally found it. A small hatch in the floor of the equipment room, hidden beneath a storage locker that had not been moved in years. The hatch was secured with a simple latch, not locked, as though whoever built it had never expected anyone to need to keep people out. I pulled the hatch open and shone my flashlight down into darkness that seemed to swallow the light. A ladder descended about 15 feet into what appeared to be a natural cavern that had been incorporated into the lighthouse's foundation. I should not have gone down. Every instinct I had screamed at me to close that hatch and forget I had ever found it. But I descended the ladder, my flashlight beam cutting through the darkness, and found myself in a rough stone chamber about 20 feet across. The walls were natural rock, but someone had clearly been using this space. In one corner, I found a makeshift camp. Old blankets, empty food cans, a small camping stove, and personal items scattered about. Someone had been living down here, hiding in the depths of the lighthouse, existing in secret beneath the feet of the keepers above. And then I saw him. In the far corner of the chamber, propped against the wall, was a body. The Arctic cold had preserved it perfectly, freezing it in place like a grotesque statue. The man was dressed in clothing from the 1970s, faded jeans and a heavy jacket, his face frozen in an expression of absolute terror. His hands were extended in front of him, as though he had been trying to ward something off, and his mouth was open in a silent scream. I stumbled backward, my flashlight beam wavering wildly, and nearly fell. My mind was racing, trying to understand what I was seeing. This was not some recent death. This man had been down here for decades, frozen and forgotten. How had no one found him? How had he gotten down here in the first place? And more terrifying than any of those questions was the realization that someone had known he was down here. Someone had sealed him in this chamber and left him to die in the darkness. I climbed out of that chamber faster than I had ever moved in my life, slamming the hatch closed behind me and dragging the storage locker back over it. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely operate the radio, but I managed to contact the mainland and report what I had found. The official response was confusion and disbelief. According to all records, no keeper had ever gone missing from Northwatch Lighthouse. But I knew what I had seen, and I demanded an immediate investigation. It took 3 days for investigators to arrive, weather preventing any earlier landing. During those 3 days, I barely slept. I kept hearing sounds from below, movement in that sealed chamber as though whatever had killed that man was still down there, stirring. On the second night, I heard footsteps moving through the lighthouse, heavy and deliberate, and I barricaded myself in my bedroom with every piece of furniture I could move. The footsteps stopped outside my door, and I heard breathing, deep and wet, right on the other side of the thin wood. Then a voice, old and cracked, said words I will never forget. I finally kept him quiet. Took so long, but I finally did it. Now he cannot tell anyone what I did. When the investigators finally arrived, they found everything exactly as I had described. The body was identified through dental records as Spencer Holt, a lighthouse keeper who had been reported missing in 1979. He had been presumed to have walked out onto the ice during a mental breakdown and drowned when the ice gave way. But Holt had never left the lighthouse. He had been locked in that sub-basement and left to die of exposure and starvation. The investigation revealed that the keeper who had reported Holt missing, a man named Ferguson, had a violent history that had been covered up by the Maritime Authority. Ferguson had been disciplined multiple times for assaulting other keepers, but he had connections within the organization that protected him. According to records that were eventually uncovered, Ferguson had accused Holt of sabotaging equipment and had claimed Holt was mentally unstable. When Holt disappeared, Ferguson's story was accepted without serious investigation. Ferguson continued working as a lighthouse keeper for another 4 years before dying of a heart attack in 1983. But on my final night at Northwatch, before the relief keeper arrived to permanently staff the lighthouse, I saw something that still defies explanation. I was in the beacon room, conducting my final equipment check, when I saw a figure standing at the base of the tower. It was an elderly man, hunched and frail, staring up at the lighthouse with an expression of malevolent satisfaction. He looked exactly like the photographs I had been shown of Ferguson. He raised one hand in a mocking wave, and then he vanished, simply ceased to exist as though he had never been there at all. Northwatch Lighthouse was decommissioned 6 months later. The official reason given was operational costs and advances in GPS technology, making manned lighthouses obsolete. But I know the real reason. Some places hold evil in their foundations, and some crimes stain a location so deeply that the only solution is abandonment. Isolation can hide terrible things, and not every missing person walks away willingly. Some disappearances are not mysteries. They are cover-ups, and the dead do not always rest quietly when injustice remains unresolved. 5 years ago, I was stationed at Greystone Lighthouse during hurricane season, and what washed ashore during that storm still has no explanation. The authorities told me to never speak about it, but I think people deserve to know what is out there. My name is Piper, and I had been working as a lighthouse keeper for nearly 8 years when I was assigned to Greystone, a remote station on the Atlantic coast about 60 miles south of Cape Hatteras. I was not some inexperienced novice frightened by isolation or strange ocean phenomena. I had weathered countless storms, witnessed bizarre marine events, and learned to distinguish between natural occurrences and genuine anomalies. I considered myself an expert in my field, someone who understood the ocean and respected its power, but was not intimidated by it. That confidence, that certainty that I had seen everything the sea could offer, was shattered in a single night. Greystone Lighthouse was built in 1892 on a barrier island that had been slowly eroding for decades. By the time I was stationed there, the lighthouse stood only about 200 yards from the high tide line, close enough that during severe storms, the waves would crash against the foundation. There had been talk of relocating or decommissioning the structure, but it remained operational, guiding ships through one of the most treacherous stretches of the Atlantic shipping lanes. The lighthouse itself was elegant in its simplicity, a white octagonal tower rising 140 feet above the sand, with keepers' quarters built into the base. I lived there alone during my rotation, which suited me perfectly. Solitude had always been my preference, and the rhythmic pulse of the ocean was better company than most people I had known. Hurricane season along the Atlantic coast is a time of constant vigilance. We track systems as they form off the African coast, watching them grow and strengthen as they move west across warm waters. In September of that year, A Category 3 hurricane named Ophelia was bearing down on the coast, and all indicators suggested it would pass within 50 miles of Greystone. I had been through hurricanes before, knew the protocols, and had confidence in the Lighthouse's ability to withstand the storm. I secured everything that could be secured, checked and rechecked the backup generator, and settled in to wait out the weather. The storm was expected to make its closest approach around midnight, with sustained winds of 115 miles per hour and storm surge potentially reaching 15 feet. Ophelia arrived right on schedule. By 11 in the evening, the wind was screaming like something alive, and rain was coming down so hard it was nearly horizontal. I was monitoring conditions from the equipment room, watching the anemometer readings climb higher and higher, when I heard something that should not have been possible over the roar of the storm. A massive impact sound, metal on rock, came from the ocean side of the lighthouse. It was not the crash of a wave or the sound of debris being thrown by the wind. It was deliberate, heavy, and it resonated through the foundation of the building like a bell being struck. I waited for dawn, knowing that venturing outside during the height of a hurricane would be suicide. The wind and storm surge would sweep me off the rocks before I made it 10 feet from the door. But as soon as the first gray light appeared and the wind dropped below 50 miles per hour, I grabbed my heavy-duty flashlight and went outside to assess damage. What I found on the rocks below the lighthouse made absolutely no sense. Wedged between two large boulders, partially submerged in the receding tide, was a metal cylinder approximately 8 feet long and 3 feet in diameter. It was covered in barnacles and marine growth, suggesting it had been in the ocean for some time. But there was no rust, no corrosion, no degradation of the metal itself. The surface was smooth and dark, almost black, with a faint iridescence like oil on water. But what made my heart rate accelerate were the symbols etched into the surface. They covered the entire cylinder in precise geometric patterns, and they were not from any language or system of notation I recognized. I have seen maritime symbols from dozens of cultures, ancient and modern, but these were something else entirely. They reminded me vaguely of circuit boards or mathematical formulas, but rendered in a way that seemed almost organic. As I approached the cylinder, I became aware of a sound, a low humming, barely audible over the wind and waves, emanating from inside the object. It was steady and rhythmic, like a heartbeat or a machine operating at low power. I reached out to touch it, and the metal was warm, noticeably warmer than the surrounding water and air. That was when I made the decision that probably saved my life. I pulled out my phone and took several photographs from multiple angles, documenting everything I could see before I reported the find. I contacted the Coast Guard on the emergency radio frequency, explaining that an unidentified object had washed ashore during the storm, and that it appeared to be man-made, but unlike anything in my experience. The response was immediate and alarming. They asked me to repeat my description twice, asked specific questions about the symbols and the humming sound, and then told me to return to the lighthouse and wait. They did not say wait for what or how long. They just said wait. Within 3 hours, helicopters arrived. Not Coast Guard helicopters, but military aircraft, unmarked except for tail numbers. Men in tactical gear deployed onto the beach, and they moved with the precision of special operations personnel. They established a perimeter around the object immediately, and 2 men in different uniforms, darker and without any identifying insignia, approached me where I stood near the lighthouse entrance. The questioning was intense. They wanted to know exactly when I had found the object, whether I had touched it, whether anyone else knew about it, and whether I had taken any photographs or video. I lied about the photographs. Some instinct told me that Admitting to having documentation would result in those photographs being confiscated, and I wanted to have something, some proof of what I had witnessed. They seemed satisfied with my answers and told me to remain inside the lighthouse while they worked. From the equipment room window, I watched them for hours. They had brought specialized equipment, devices that they held near the cylinder, taking readings that made them gesture animatedly to each other. At one point, I saw one of the men speaking urgently into a satellite phone, and whatever he heard in response made him turn and look directly at the lighthouse, directly at the window where I was standing. I stepped back instinctively, feeling exposed despite the distance. By late afternoon, a large military transport helicopter arrived, carrying what appeared to be a specialized container. The divers went into the water and attached rigging to the cylinder, and they lifted it out with precision, placing it carefully into the container. The entire operation took less than 30 minutes, and then they were preparing to leave. That was when the man in the dark uniform came to speak with me again. He was polite but firm. He explained that what I had found was weather monitoring equipment from an experimental program, that it had broken free from its moorings during the storm, and that its recovery was classified for national security reasons. He thanked me for my cooperation and asked me to sign a non-disclosure agreement, which was really not a request at all. The document was vague, stating only that I agreed not to discuss classified equipment or operations with any unauthorized personnel. I signed it because I understood that refusing was not actually an option. Before he left, the man looked at me for a long moment and said something I will never forget. He said, "You found weather equipment. That is the only thing you found. It would be unfortunate if you suffered an accident or lost your keeper's license over misremembering events. People who work in isolated locations need to be reliable and stable. We would hate to have concerns about your reliability." It was not a direct threat, but the implication was crystal clear. Speak about this, and there would be consequences. They left as quickly as they had arrived, and I was alone again on the beach, with nothing but disturbed sand and my own racing thoughts. That night, I checked my phone for the photographs I had taken. Every single one was corrupted, showing only gray static. I checked my backup cloud storage, my computer, every device I had. The photographs had deleted themselves, or more likely, someone had remotely wiped them while I was distracted. The only proof I had that any of it had happened was my own memory and the disturbed sand on the beach that would be smoothed away by the next tide. I kept my position at Greystone for another 2 months, finishing my contracted rotation, but I transferred to an inland station as soon as I could. The ocean no longer felt like something I understood. It felt like something that held secrets I was not meant to discover. And every time I looked at the horizon, I wondered what else was out there beneath the waves. 3 years later, I was watching a documentary about unidentified submersible objects, phenomena that Navy vessels and research ships have been recording for decades. Objects that move underwater at speeds that should not be possible, that appear on sonar and then vanish, that seem to defy our understanding of physics and engineering. At one point, the documentary showed grainy footage of symbols that had been recorded from one of these objects. They were identical to the symbols I had seen on the cylinder at Greystone. I contacted the documentary producers, offering to share my experience, but I received no response. I tried reaching out to researchers who study these phenomena, but no one would return my calls or emails. The ocean hides things governments do not want found, and some discoveries come with consequences. Not everything that washes ashore is meant for civilian eyes, and not every mystery will be solved. If you work near the water, Understand that you may witness things you will never be allowed to discuss, and that the truth is often buried under layers of official denial. What I found that night was real. And somewhere in a classified facility, that cylinder sits in storage, its purpose and origin known only to a select few who will never share what they know. I worked at Blackwater Lighthouse for 2 seasons, and I learned why they have the 3-day rule. No keeper stays alone longer than 3 days. I am the reason that rule exists, and I have to live with what I did. My name is Hayden, and before my experience at Blackwater, I considered myself unshakable. I had served 4 years in the Coast Guard, worked on deep-sea fishing vessels in the Bering Sea, and spent 18 months as a solo keeper at a remote weather station in the Aleutian Islands. Isolation did not frighten me. In fact, I preferred it to the complications of social interaction and the noise of civilization. When I was offered a position at Blackwater Lighthouse, a station known for its harsh conditions and high turnover rate, I accepted immediately. The pay was good, the work was straightforward, and I would be left alone to do my job without interference. It seemed perfect. Blackwater Lighthouse sits on a rocky island about 30 miles off the coast of Maine, in an area where the Atlantic currents create dangerous riptides and unpredictable weather patterns. The lighthouse has been in continuous operation since 1874, and it has a reputation among maritime workers as a difficult posting. Most keepers serve their contracted period and request immediate transfer. Some leave before their contracts are complete, citing personal emergencies or health issues. The Maritime Authority attributed the high turnover to the harsh weather and extreme isolation. But there were rumors among the keeper community that Blackwater was different somehow. That something about the place affected people in ways that were difficult to articulate. During my initial briefing, the regional supervisor mentioned almost casually that there was a 3-day rule at Blackwater. Keepers were required to work in pairs, and no individual was permitted to remain alone at the lighthouse for longer than 72 consecutive hours. If a keeper's partner needed to leave for any reason, a replacement had to arrive within 3 days, or the remaining keeper was required to evacuate as well. When I asked why this rule existed, the supervisor became vague, mentioning something about psychological studies showing that extended isolation could affect judgment and decision-making. It sounded like bureaucratic nonsense to me, the kind of policy created by people who had never actually worked in isolated environments and did not understand that some people thrived in solitude. In December of 2016, my partner keeper requested emergency leave to attend to a family crisis. His father had suffered a stroke, and he needed to return to the mainland immediately. The Maritime Authority scrambled to find a replacement, but a winter storm system was moving through the region, and helicopter transport was grounded. They estimated it would take 4 to 5 days before conditions improved enough to bring in a relief keeper. The supervisor asked if I would be comfortable staying alone at Blackwater until then, with the understanding that if I felt uncomfortable at any point, I could trigger the emergency beacon and they would evacuate me as soon as weather permitted. I agreed without hesitation. In fact, I volunteered enthusiastically. I would earn a significant bonus for the extended solo duty, and I genuinely looked forward to having the lighthouse entirely to myself. The other keepers warned me against it. One man, someone who had worked at Blackwater years earlier, pulled me aside and said something strange. He told me that a previous keeper named Quinn had broken the 3-day rule and had to be institutionalized afterward. He said Quinn had been found wandering the rocks around the lighthouse, speaking to people who were not there, completely detached from reality. But I dismissed these warnings as superstition and the paranoia of people who were not cut out for true isolation. The first 3 days alone at Blackwater were exactly what I had hoped for. I established efficient routines, completed maintenance tasks that had been neglected, and enjoyed the profound silence that comes with being truly alone. I slept well, ate regularly, and felt more centered than I had in months. On the morning of day 4, I woke feeling completely normal, made coffee, and began my equipment checks. Everything seemed fine until that evening when I was preparing dinner and realized that every light in the lighthouse was on, despite the fact that I had turned them all off before going to bed the previous night. Every single light in the keeper's quarters, the stairwell, the lantern room, everything was blazing. I told myself I must have forgotten to turn them off, that I had been tired and made a mistake. But I knew that was not true. I had distinct memories of going through the lighthouse, room by room, shutting off lights as I always did before bed. Still, there was no other explanation that made sense. I turned off all the lights again, carefully and deliberately, and went to bed. On the morning of day 5, every light was on again. This time, I checked the security camera system that monitored the lighthouse interior. I scrolled back through the footage from the previous night and felt my blood run cold. The cameras had recorded me walking through the lighthouse at 3:15 in the morning, methodically turning on every light. I watched myself on the grainy footage, moving with purpose, my face blank and expressionless. I had absolutely no memory of doing this. I had been asleep, or so I thought, but the evidence was undeniable. I had been sleepwalking, something I had never done in my entire life. That discovery should have been enough to make me trigger the emergency beacon and request evacuation. But I convinced myself it was just stress, a temporary phenomenon that would pass. I was embarrassed by the idea of admitting I could not handle a few extra days of isolation, that I was somehow weaker than I had believed myself to be. So I stayed. Day 6 was when things became truly frightening. I woke up in the afternoon, which was unusual because I typically rose early. My body ached in ways that suggested intense physical activity, but I could not remember doing anything strenuous. When I looked in the bathroom mirror, I discovered bruises on my arms and shoulders, dark purple marks that looked like someone had grabbed me forcefully. I had no memory of injuring myself. I checked the security footage again and found hours of recorded activity that I had no recollection of whatsoever. The footage showed me in the lantern room in the middle of the night, pacing in circles, stopping periodically to stare out at the ocean. At one point, I saw myself approach the glass and press my hands against it, leaning forward as though trying to push through. Then I watched myself go to the equipment room and begin taking tools off the wall. I carried a hammer and a pry bar up to the keeper's quarters and began striking the walls, hitting the same spot repeatedly, creating a hole in the plaster. After several minutes of this, I stopped, returned the tools, and went back to bed. I found the hole in the wall exactly where the footage showed it would be. But the most disturbing part of the footage was the moment when I paused in the middle of pacing and turned to look directly at the security camera. My face was completely blank, my eyes unfocused, but my mouth was moving. I increased the volume and heard myself speaking in a low monotone, saying the same phrases over and over. They won out. I can hear them in the walls. I need to break the walls. They won out. I checked the lighthouse maintenance log, which I had been keeping meticulously since arriving. There were entries in my handwriting that I did not remember writing, scattered among my normal daily notes. The entries were disturbing. The walls are too thick. I need more time. They're getting louder. And if I could just break through, I could let them out. They have been trapped for so long. The handwriting was mine, but I had no memory of writing these words. I did not believe anyone was trapped in the walls. I was not hearing voices. At least, I did not think I was. That night, day 7 of my isolation, I decided I would trigger the emergency beacon in the morning. I barricaded myself in my bedroom, pushing the dresser against the door, and tried to stay awake. I was terrified of what I might do if I fell asleep, what the sleepwalking version of myself might be capable of. But exhaustion eventually overcame fear, and I drifted off sometime after midnight. I woke up standing on the exterior gallery railing, 120 feet above the rocks, with my toes hanging over the edge. The wind was blowing hard, and I was gripping the lighthouse rail with one hand while the other reached out into empty space. One step forward, and I would have plunged to my death. The terror that flooded through me when I realized where I was and what I was about to do gave me enough shock to step backward onto the gallery floor. I scrambled to the door, threw myself inside, and triggered the emergency beacon immediately. The rescue helicopter arrived 8 hours later. During those 8 hours, I did not sleep. I did not let myself close my eyes. I sat in the equipment room with every light blazing and the security monitor in front of me so I could watch myself, so I would know if I started to move. When the rescue crew arrived, they found me in a state of complete psychological collapse, shaking and unable to articulate what had happened. The psychiatric evaluation that followed found no underlying mental illness, no psychotic disorder, no explanation for the extreme dissociative episodes I had experienced. But the psychiatrist noted that I had experienced complete personality dissociation, a state in which a part of my consciousness had taken control of my body while my conscious mind was essentially offline. He could not explain why it had happened or why it had stopped once I left the lighthouse. I learned later that 12 keepers had died at Blackwater Lighthouse since its construction in 1874. Every single death occurred between day 4 and day 7 of a solo shift. Some were ruled suicides, others accidents. But the pattern was undeniable. The Maritime Authority had known about it for decades, but had never officially acknowledged it. The 3-day rule was implemented quietly after a keeper died in 1998, but it was never explained properly, never enforced strictly enough. After my incident, the rules changed. Blackwater Lighthouse now requires a minimum of 2 keepers at all times, and individual shifts are limited to 3 days maximum. An investigation into the lighthouse revealed abnormally high electromagnetic readings from outdated equipment that had been in place since the lighthouse's construction. The equipment was replaced, but the damage to the keepers who had been exposed over the years could not be undone. Some safety rules exist because people died learning them. Extended isolation in certain places can break your mind in ways you cannot predict or control. Whatever happened to me at Blackwater, whether it was electromagnetic interference affecting my brain function or something else entirely, I know that I came within 1 step of death. I know that something in that lighthouse wanted me to die, or wanted to use me to free something that should never be released. I will never work in an isolated lighthouse again, and I will never dismiss safety protocols as unnecessary bureaucracy. The 3-day rule exists for a reason, and I am living proof of what happens when that rule is broken. Growing up in a lighthouse keeper family, I heard the stories about the woman in the water. I thought they were myths to scare new keepers. Then I took my first solo watch at Widow's Point Lighthouse, and I learned some myths are memories. My name is Quinn, and I am a 3rd-generation lighthouse keeper. My grandfather kept lights along the New England coast for 40 years, and my father followed in his footsteps for another 30. I grew up hearing their stories, learning their trade, and understanding that lighthouse keeping was not just a job, but a calling, a tradition passed down through generations. The ocean was in my blood, and I knew from childhood that I would spend my life at the edge of the world, keeping the lights burning for ships that passed in the darkness. Widow's Point Lighthouse stands on a rocky promontory jutting into the Atlantic about 12 miles south of Portland, Maine. It was built in 1847 after a series of devastating shipwrecks claimed over 100 lives in a single winter. The lighthouse has a dark history, one that every local fisherman knows, but outsiders rarely hear. In 1849, a keeper named Joseph Delaney was stationed at Widow's Point with his wife, Sarah, and their 2 young children. That winter, Joseph received word that the ship carrying his brother and nephew had gone down in a storm. Joseph had been on duty when the ship passed, but he had failed to spot the vessel's distress signals in time. By the time rescue ships reached the wreck, everyone aboard was dead. Joseph fell into a deep depression, blaming himself for the deaths. According to the historical accounts, Sarah tried to comfort him, but his guilt consumed him. 3 weeks after receiving the news, Joseph walked out onto the ice during a blizzard and never returned. His body was found days later, frozen in the water a mile from shore. Sarah Delaney never recovered from the loss. She remained at Widow's Point with her children, taking over her husband's duties as keeper, determined to prevent other families from experiencing the same tragedy. But the isolation and grief were too much. 6 months after Joseph's death, Sarah's children both died of influenza during a harsh winter storm that prevented any medical assistance from reaching the lighthouse. Sarah buried them herself on the rocks near the lighthouse. A week later, during another storm, Sarah was seen by a passing ship standing on the rocks below the lighthouse in her white nightgown, staring out at the sea. The next morning, her body was found in the water at the base of the cliffs. The official report called it an accidental drowning, but everyone who knew her understood it was suicide. Sarah had thrown herself into the ocean, unable to bear the weight of her losses. For over 170 years, fishermen and sailors have reported seeing a woman in white standing on the rocks near Widow's Point during storms. They call her Sarah Delaney, or simply the woman in white. And there is a superstition among the maritime community that when she appears, someone will die at sea within 3 days unless her warning is heeded. My grandfather saw her twice during his career, and both times, he told me, ships were saved because he had been extra vigilant in watching for vessels in distress. My father saw her once, and he managed to spot a fishing boat whose engine had failed in heavy seas, directing rescue efforts that saved 4 lives. They both spoke of her with respect, even reverence, believing that Sarah's spirit remained at Widow's Point, trying to prevent the kind of tragedy that had destroyed her family. I took my first solo keeper position at Widow's Point in the fall of 2017. I was 28 years old and eager to prove myself capable of handling the responsibilities my father and grandfather had carried with such skill. The position had been difficult to fill because of the lighthouse's reputation, but I viewed the stories about Sarah Delaney as family folklore, comforting tales that gave meaning to the difficult work of lighthouse keeping. I did not truly believe in ghosts or supernatural warnings. I believed in vigilance, preparation, and the power of human dedication to save lives. I thought the stories were just stories. My first storm at Widow's Point came in early November, a powerful nor'easter that brought wind gusts over 70 miles per hour and waves that crashed against the base of the lighthouse with enough force to make the entire structure shudder. I was monitoring weather conditions and radio traffic, maintaining constant communication with the Coast Guard about shipping activity in the area. The storm was expected to last through the night, and several vessels had already diverted to safer waters or returned to port. I was preparing coffee in the keeper's quarters around midnight when I glanced out the window toward the rocks below. She was standing there, exactly as my grandfather had described. A woman in a white dress, her hair loose and flowing in the wind that should have torn her clothing and knocked her off her feet. But she stood perfectly still, untouched by the storm, staring out at the black ocean. Her dress glowed faintly in the darkness, as though lit from within. I felt my heart stop. Every rational explanation fled my mind, and I was left with the undeniable reality that I was looking at something that should not exist. I grabbed binoculars with shaking hands and focused on the figure. Her face was pale and beautiful, with an expression of profound sadness. She was not looking at the lighthouse or at me. She was staring fixedly at a point on the horizon, her hand raised as though pointing toward something I could not see. I tried to follow her gaze, scanning the dark water with my binoculars, but I could see nothing beyond the waves and storm. Then I remembered what my grandfather had told me. If you see her, she is showing you where to look. She is warning you that someone needs help. I immediately returned to the radio and contacted the Coast Guard, informing them that I had reason to believe a vessel might be in distress to the north of Widow's Point, even though I had no concrete evidence. The operator was skeptical, but protocol required them to investigate any potential distress situation. They dispatched a helicopter to search the area I indicated. For the next 2 hours, I maintained constant watch on the northern waters, straining my eyes against the darkness and storm. The woman remained on the rocks below, still pointing, still staring. Then, at 2:30 in the morning, I spotted it through my telescope. A faint emergency strobe light, barely visible between the waves. A pleasure yacht had lost engine power and was drifting dangerously close to a reef system that would tear it apart. I immediately reported the sighting, and Coast Guard rescue helicopters were diverted to the location. The rescue took 3 hours, but all 4 people aboard the yacht were saved. When I looked back down at the rocks, the woman was gone. I went outside at dawn, after the storm had passed, and searched the rocks where she had been standing. There were no footprints, no evidence that anyone had been there. But I knew what I had seen, and more importantly, I knew that 4 people were alive because of the warning she had given. I saw Sarah Delaney 2 more times during my tenure at Widow's Point. The second time was during a winter storm when a cargo ship's navigation system failed, and they were heading directly toward shallow waters. Her appearance prompted me to contact the vessel and warn them of the danger, preventing what would have been a catastrophic grounding. The third time was during a dense fog when a small fishing boat's radio failed. I only spotted them because I had been scanning the exact area where Sarah had been pointing, seeing their visual distress signals that would otherwise have been invisible in the fog. I have now been keeping lights for 11 years, and I consider Sarah Delaney to be my most reliable partner in the work of saving lives at sea. Other keepers at Widow's Point have reported seeing her as well, though she does not appear to everyone. My father believes she only reveals herself to keepers who will act on her warnings, those who will take the risk of seeming foolish or paranoid in order to potentially save lives. I have come to understand that her appearances are not hauntings in the traditional sense. She is not trapped or suffering. She has chosen to remain, to continue the work she started when she took over her husband's duties after his death. She is still trying to prevent other families from experiencing the loss that destroyed her own. The maritime community in this region knows about Sarah. When I mentioned seeing her to veteran sailors, They nod with understanding and respect. They tell their own stories of near misses and unexplained warnings that saved their lives. The woman in white is part of the living folklore of these waters, a presence that is accepted and even welcomed by those who understand what she represents. I know that to most people, this story will sound like the delusion of someone who has spent too long in isolation, someone whose mind has created comforting explanations for coincidence and chance. But I have seen her with my own eyes on 3 separate occasions, and each time her warning has led directly to lives being saved. I have spoken with other keepers who have had identical experiences. The evidence may be anecdotal, but it is consistent and compelling. Not every ghost is malevolent, and some legends carry truth that protects the living. The dead sometimes watch over the places where they suffered most, trying to prevent others from experiencing the same pain. Sarah Delaney lost everything she loved to the sea and to the failures of lighthouse keeping. She spent the rest of her life trying to make amends, and apparently, death has not ended her vigil. I am honored to work alongside her, to be worthy of her trust, and to help her continue the mission she began over 170 years ago. If you ever find yourself at sea near Widow's Point and you see a woman in white standing on the rocks during a storm, do not dismiss her as imagination or superstition. She is showing you where to look, warning you of danger that may not yet be visible. Heed her warning, and you might save a life or your own. In December 2019, I was stranded at Stormbreak Lighthouse for 19 days when my relief keeper never arrived. By the time rescue came, I had made a discovery that explained why no one wanted to work there anymore, and why my predecessor MacArthur vanished without a trace. My name is Jace, and I was working as a temporary keeper, covering a staff shortage during the winter season. I had taken the position because I needed money quickly, and lighthouse work paid well for short-term contracts. Stormbreak Lighthouse sits on a rocky island about 8 miles off the coast of Northern California, a notorious posting that had seen 7 keepers quit in the previous 18 months. The Maritime Authority was desperate enough that they were accepting anyone with basic qualifications and a willingness to endure the isolation. The briefing I received before deployment was minimal at best. A harried supervisor in a regional office spent maybe 20 minutes going over basic procedures, handed me an equipment manual, and assured me that my 14-day rotation would pass quickly. He mentioned, almost as an afterthought, that the previous keeper, a man named MacArthur, had left abruptly after only 6 days, citing family emergency. When I asked if MacArthur had left any notes or observations that might be useful, the supervisor said everything had been removed with his personal effects and that I would be starting fresh. There was something in his tone, a forced casualness, that made me wonder what he was not telling me. But I needed the money, and I had already signed the contract, so I did not press for details. I arrived at Stormbreak on a cold morning in early December, dropped off by supply boat along with provisions for my 2-week stay. The lighthouse was exactly what I expected. Functional but worn, with the kind of institutional bleakness that comes from decades of minimal maintenance and high turnover. The living quarters were clean enough, the equipment seemed operational, and the beacon was functioning normally. I spent my first day familiarizing myself with the layout, checking systems, and establishing my routines. Everything seemed straightforward until I received the radio call on day 8. A major storm system was tracking toward the coast, and the supply boat that was supposed to bring my relief keeper could not depart until conditions improved. The supervisor apologized and said they would get someone out to me as soon as the weather cleared, probably another 3 or 4 days at most. I was not thrilled about the delay, but I had weathered storms before and had adequate supplies. I told them it was fine and settled in to wait. By day 12, communications with the mainland had become sporadic due to the storm interfering with radio signals. I was told relief was still delayed, but should arrive within 48 hours. Then on day 13, the radio failed completely. I spent hours trying to repair it, working through every troubleshooting procedure in the manual. But something in the system had burned out and I did not have the parts to fix it. I was completely cut off, dependent on the storm clearing and someone on the mainland realizing I had lost communication. The isolation began to wear on me in ways I had not anticipated. The constant sound of wind and waves, the gray darkness that seemed to press against the windows, the absolute absence of any human contact. I tried to maintain my routines, but without the radio checks that normally structured my days, time began to feel strange and elastic. I would look at my watch and realize that hours had passed while I sat staring out the window, unable to account for where that time had gone. On day 14, when my rotation should have ended, I began exploring parts of the lighthouse I had not thoroughly investigated before. There were storage rooms in the lower level that I had not needed to access, areas that were not part of my regular maintenance rounds. I was looking for anything that might help repair the radio, or at least give me something productive to do while I waited for rescue. In one of the storage rooms, behind boxes of old equipment and spare parts, I found a locked metal cabinet. The lock was rusted but not particularly secure, and I managed to force it open with a screwdriver. Inside the cabinet, I found personal items that clearly belonged to the previous keeper, MacArthur. There was a phone, still in a waterproof case, a wallet containing identification and credit cards, car keys, a watch. These were not things someone would voluntarily leave behind if they were evacuating for a family emergency. These were essentials, the kinds of items people carry with them always. I pulled out the phone and saw that the screen was cracked, and there were dark stains on the case that looked disturbingly like dried blood. I found a charging cable and plugged the phone into the lighthouse electrical system, my hands shaking slightly as I waited for it to power on. It took several minutes, but eventually the screen lit up. The phone was not password protected, and I immediately went to the photo gallery. What I found there sent ice through my veins. MacArthur had recorded a series of videos, apparently using the phone to document something he had discovered. The first video showed him speaking directly to the camera, his face pale and his eyes wide. His voice was shaking as he said, "I have been hearing things. Movement in the walls. Footsteps in parts of the lighthouse where no one should be." I thought I was going crazy until I found the access point. Someone else is here. Someone has been living in this lighthouse, hiding in spaces I did not even know existed. The next video was recorded at night, the camera showing a narrow corridor I did not recognize, lit only by MacArthur's flashlight. His breathing was labored as he whispered, "I am in the hidden passage behind the north wall. It runs parallel to the main structure. There are supplies down here, food, water, blankets. Someone has been living here for months, maybe longer." The camera swung to show a makeshift camp, exactly as he had described. The final video was dated the day MacArthur supposedly left for his family emergency. The video showed him barricading the door to his sleeping quarters, stacking furniture against it while he spoke rapidly to the camera. He tried to get in last night. I heard him at the door, trying the handle, scratching at the wood. I did not sleep. I cannot sleep. He is still here, somewhere in the lighthouse. I have called for emergency evacuation, but the weather is too bad for helicopter pickup. They say someone will come tomorrow. I just have to make it through tonight. If you are watching this, if you are the next keeper they send here, do not sleep alone. Always lock your doors. And for the love of God, do not go into the lower levels alone. The video ended abruptly. I stood in that storage room, holding MacArthur's phone, and felt my reality shift. If MacArthur had been evacuated, why were his personal belongings still here? Why had his phone been locked in a cabinet instead of taken with him? And most terrifying, if someone had been living secretly in the lighthouse when MacArthur was here, were they still here now? That night, I did not sleep. I barricaded myself in the equipment room on the upper level, as far from the hidden passages as I could get, with every light in the lighthouse burning. I sat with my back against the wall, a heavy wrench in my hands, listening to every sound. Around midnight, I heard them. Footsteps, slow and deliberate, moving through the lower level. They were too heavy to be imagination, too regular to be wind or settling structure. Someone was walking through the lighthouse. The footsteps moved closer, climbing the stairs toward my position. I heard them pause outside the equipment room door, then breathing, deep and wet, right on the other side of the thin wood. A voice, barely more than a whisper, said words that I will never forget. The lighthouse is mine. They always leave. You will leave too. I saw a shadow move across the crack at the bottom of the door, saw the handle slowly turn as someone tested it from the other side. The door was locked, but it was not a security door, just a simple interior latch that could easily be forced. I waited in absolute terror for the door to burst open, for whoever was out there to come through. But after several minutes, the footsteps retreated back down the stairs. I stayed in that room for 3 more days, leaving only briefly to grab food and water from the kitchen when I was certain I heard no one moving below. I fired every emergency flare I could find, hoping someone on the mainland would see them and realize something was wrong. On the morning of day 19, a Coast Guard helicopter finally arrived. They had been attempting to reach me for days after the Yacht radio failure, but weather had prevented any rescue attempt until that morning. When I told the Coast Guard crew what I had found and what I had experienced, they conducted a thorough search of the lighthouse. They discovered exactly what MacArthur's video had shown: an elaborate network of concealed spaces within the walls of the lighthouse, accessed through a panel in the lower storage room that was nearly invisible unless you knew where to look. The spaces contained months' worth of supplies, makeshift furniture, and personal items. DNA testing on items found in the hidden spaces matched a hiker named Spencer Holt, who had been reported missing in 2017 while hiking near the coast. Further investigation revealed that Holt had apparently suffered some kind of mental breakdown while hiking and had discovered the lighthouse's hidden spaces, perhaps originally built for smuggling in the 19th century. He had been living there for over 2 years, emerging only when keepers were absent, stealing supplies from their stores, and hiding whenever new keepers arrived. The high turnover rate at Stormbreak suddenly made sense. Other keepers had probably sensed something was wrong, had perhaps heard sounds or noticed supplies disappearing, and had left rather than confront whatever was happening. The most disturbing discovery came when divers searched the waters around the lighthouse. They found human remains on the rocks below the cliff face on the north side of the lighthouse. Forensic analysis identified them as belonging to MacArthur. The cause of death was determined to be blunt force trauma consistent with a fall from significant height, but there were also defensive wounds on his hands and arms, suggesting he had been in a struggle before he fell. The official ruling was homicide. Holt was eventually located and arrested. He was deemed mentally incompetent to stand trial and was committed to a psychiatric facility where he remains today. Stormbreak Lighthouse was decommissioned permanently, the automated beacon maintained remotely, but no longer requiring human keepers. The most dangerous thing in isolation is not being alone. It is thinking you are alone when you are not. MacArthur learned that lesson, and it cost him his life. I learned it too, and I was lucky enough to survive. Always secure your environment and trust your instincts when something feels wrong. If supplies disappear, if you hear sounds that should not be there, if you feel watched in a place where you should be alone, do not dismiss those feelings as paranoia. Sometimes, the most rational response to irrational fear is to leave immediately and let someone else figure out why you were afraid.